Hey Life Group, it's Pastor Caleb. Great to have you all gathered again together to study the sermon and think a little bit more about what it means to be the church in North America today. Before we get started with the study, take a few moments and as a group, discuss and share with the group the person who brought you to know about Jesus. Maybe it was your parents and you were baptized as a child. Maybe it was someone later on in your life. But share who that person was and how they brought you to know Jesus. All right, let's get into the study. The text that we read from Romans chapter 14 and 15 deals with a big word called adiaphora. I didn't use the word in the sermon at all, but for you, I want you to learn that word, adiaphora. It basically means things that are neither commanded nor forbidden, or things that aren't necessarily sin, aren't necessarily righteous. For example, you could eat cheese, or you could eat meat, or you could eat vegetables. It's adiaphora. The Bible doesn't say you have to eat meat or have to eat cheese or have to eat vegetables. Now, specifically in this text, the thing that they're talking about is eating meat because of the Old Testament implications of the law that said that Old Testament believers could only eat certain types of meat. Now, for us in the New Testament, we don't deal with that problem because we don't have Old Testament Christians who are still part of our congregations today. But there are issues of adiaphora where the Bible doesn't say specifically to do this thing or that thing that we still have conflict over. Now, I don't want you to think specifically about our congregation, although you might, but I want you as a group to come up with 3 to 5 adiaphoras that churches usually end up in conflict over. Take a couple minutes and see if you can put together a list of 3 to 5 of those things the Bible neither commands nor forbids. Now that you've made your list, I want you to insert those 3 to 5 things in the text as you read it. I want you to actually take Romans 14, verses 1 through 7. And wherever it talks about eating meat or eating vegetables or not eating meat, whatever the case may be, insert that issue. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's just say the issue is what sort of music we're going to play on Sunday. So I'm going to start reading the text for you to give you an example of what this looks like. This is Romans 14. Accept the one whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters. One person's faith allows them to play any song they want in worship, but another, whose faith is weak, plays only certain songs. I want you to take the 3 to 5 things that you wrote down, or maybe you remember, and read the text, inserting those ideas. And then tell your group how that makes you feel, or how that changes how you maybe even think about that issue. Read Romans 14, 1 to 7, inserting that word or those words into the text. Later in Romans chapter 14, it says this. This is verse 10 and also verse 13. You then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you treat them with contempt? And then verse 13. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind to not put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. We see in the text 2 places where Paul says, do not judge another person. Now, judgment in our society is a difficult thing to talk about because there are a lot of people who would say, you can't judge me, you can't read into my intentions, you can't know me, so stop judging me. In what ways is it right for a Christian to judge another person? And in what ways is it wrong? Take a few minutes and discuss that with your group. Chapter 14, verse 15 says these words, if your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you are no longer acting in love. Do not, by your eating, destroy someone for whom Christ died. It's a strong statement, isn't it? That by doing something that we know is right, but another person may not know is right yet, we could destroy someone. Take a few minutes with your group and ask, how might that happen? And use specific examples. Maybe use the 3 to 5 things that you wrote down that typically are conflicts in churches. How might somebody acting in knowledge instead of weakness destroy someone else's faith? Discuss that. Chapter 14, verse 19 says these words, "Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification." Edification is kind of a weird word. We don't use it very often. It's essentially to be blessed or to grow as you hear words, right? So the text says, do everything that leads to peace and mutual edification. Now, I don't think our issue is so much with peace and mutual edification, but being willing to do anything. Discuss with your group for a few minutes, how far are most people willing to go for peace and edification? And how is that different from what God is calling us to do in this text? Chapter 14, verse 22 says this, "So whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God." Now, is the text saying that whatever our opinion is about a matter of adiaphora, that we should keep it to ourselves? Discuss that with your group. The last question for today comes from the verses that I focused on particularly in the sermon, chapter 15, verse 1 and 15, verse 17. I'll read those again for you. 15, verse 1 says, "We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves." And chapter 15, verse 7 says, "Accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God." Now, I said that bearing one another's failings is to see that someone is actually wrong, or at least in your opinion wrong, but then to feel what it is like to be them. To do 4 things that I listed in the sermon, the first of which is listen to them, really listen to them. To hear what they actually think, not to judge what they say right away, but to feel like what they feel. Second, to be willing to change yourself. To be so certain that the issue is less important than the relationship that you would actually sacrifice even your way of thinking for the sake of knowing what your brother or sister in faith thinks. Third, I said, be patient with that person, because they may not change quickly, and they may offend you again and again and again, and they may confront you again and again and again with their failings. And then fourth, I said, to be patient with God, because God is the one who actually makes the change happen in the end. And that God is being patient with that person, and therefore you ought to be patient with God. As we think about accepting one another, welcoming them in, and feeling what it's like to be another person on the opposite side of a conflict with us, which of those 4 steps do you feel like is the most difficult? Just to repeat them for your sake: really listening, being willing to change yourself, being patient with that person, or being patient with God. Take a couple minutes and discuss that with your group. As my last challenge for you before you leave tonight, I encourage you to read again the text that we read briefly before the sermon, Galatians 6, 1-10. Read it with your group, and just as a group, pick out a phrase or a word or a sentence that particularly sticks out to you as important, and share it with the group. Take that text and keep it on your heart this week, especially the last verse, that we should do good to all, but especially to the family of believers. God bless you, and I'll see you next Sunday as we continue our series. Thanks for being in Life Group. You guys are awesome.